If you need more room, you can remove all of that.
What other topics are? That's okay. That should be enough room.
Okay.
Sorry. Do we have to reserve questions till the end?
It's up to the...
Ask during the... Yeah.
Can we ask through the...
Sure. So, I guess talking about testing from a DevOps perspective is really talking about how people create applications and deploy them to begin with. So, obviously back in the days from Waterfall and now to Agile and talking about Scrums and how people develop, really understanding how the requirements flow through. So, if we think about requirements and how they normally come through, we generally have the business, of course, at the top. They'll come through generally to some level of architect, maybe a platform architect, or a higher level enterprise architect, if you really like people at that level. So we'll call them a platform architect for now. And really these job roles change between company to company.
Okay, yeah, I'll check.
And then from the platform architect, it really goes into the dev teams, right? So you might have a technical architect, you might have a tech lead, and potentially you might have multiple groups. So depending on the application, you might have a tech lead from an app perspective, you might have an infrastructure tech lead. And in big deployments, you might have multiple app tech leads, right? Working on different applications or different parts of the application. Underneath that, obviously we have a whole bunch of devs.
Have you got your card?
Yeah, that was a spare one.
You can't come up.
Yeah. Don't get lost. So, from a dev perspective, obviously you might have multiple dev teams working on different sections. They're obviously going to potentially talk about best practice. They'll have a CI tool where multiple of them check stuff in on different streams, on different packages from a testing perspective. That'll then go into what? Into beginning, to system test. From system test into integration test. From integration test potentially into SVT. And from SVT into UAT. And then obviously from UAT into production. Any comments on that? Anything I've missed?
OAT.
OAT, you could also have IVVT, you know, if you want to put in verification testing. All right, I'll put that here. Right? So what happens? There's a feedback loop in every single one of these steps, right? So to look at this differently, at every one of these steps, from system test to integration testing to SVT, IVVT, UAT, they can all feed back into the dev stream in case there's problems, right? So at any one point, they can all feed back into the whole development lifecycle. And even in production, obviously from production, if we reproduce problems, we can also hurry that back in. From a business perspective, new requirements come in, and then you've basically got your SDLC from a lifecycle perspective. So, based on that kind of model, where do people generally see performance testing? Where does performance testing really matter? Or measuring performance?
At the end, almost.
So at the end, so at UAT, or even I would probably argue at SVT. So application performance monitoring testing really lives here. Obviously you need it in production. Why? Because if you're not monitoring production, how do you know how it's performing? And from a DevOps perspective, how does this move around? So I'd actually argue that when you first do system testing and integration testing, you really need to measure performance there too, because it's the earliest place you can fix things. Even before you put load on it, you can look at the test, you can look at the performance. If you're doing unit testing, you can compare the performance of the code previously to now, even just on a basic regression test.
You know, I would argue that if you go back to the old days, the first part of that systems development lifecycle used to be called quality. And it all, it used to be called how you build quality into your code and make sure that it meets user requirements in the first place. And that whole piece was quality. And then what really has happened is as these things dropped into production, the ops guys used to call it performance. And these things are starting to meet now in the development lifecycle. You know what I'm saying? And so it's kind of how far up is performance becoming relevant?
Or how far down is it becoming relevant? So it's both ways. So from a top-down perspective and from a bottom-up. Because the earlier you catch things, obviously, if it's architectural issues, the earlier you can fix it. And the less more code gets developed and the less performance issues you have. What you typically see in a non-DevOps world is obviously different ops, dev, and even testing silos. And I guess you'd see that in a lot of big companies, generally have different teams that do that. And handoffs between teams generally become a problem. So one of the questions is how can you implement effectively at every level from a test, and you don't even have to instrument it all, but how do you, from a process perspective, get better at handoffs between teams? And when you have a problem in SVT or UAT, how do you analyze the root cause of that as quickly as possible? And how can you all speak the same kind of language? So these are common problems that I see across a lot of our customers. Some are a lot more focused on dev, some are a lot more focused on tests. Obviously they care about production, but a lot of the times production is actually outsourced. So, and it can be outsourced at any level. We've seen customers where the dev is completely outsourced. We've seen it where production is completely outsourced. So what happens is that not only do you get silos, organizationally you also get things like contracts and whose role and responsibility are the issues organizationally. So from a performance perspective, there are different tools that you can use to implement with a development perspective, so integrate with IDEs to look at performance, and from a regression testing perspective at SVT, there's a whole bunch of different performance testing that integrates with, say, load runner or performer or whatever you're doing to use load. And then when you get to production, there's obviously, everyone knows about all the production tool set as well. So how does this get implemented? How does this look like from an end state perspective? So in reality, how many environments do people generally utilize from a lifecycle perspective here? 2, 3, 4, generally?
Generally around 3. You have SIT, you have, you got SVT if you're lucky, right? And you have UAT. And sometimes you might have a pre-prod. Generally it's 3 if you're lucky.
3 pre-production.
Well, that's just in testing, and then there's the development.
Sorry, then there's the
environments
development
as well.
environment, which is the 4th, yeah.
And they might have a sand pit and a few development environments.
And local development environments, obviously, when they first do their integration test on their local desktop or laptop or whatever. In production. Hopefully you don't have a DR dev environment, so that would get pretty costly.
You might have SVT. Yeah.
Well, so and some of our customers actually use their DR as for SVT because it's a copy of production.
Absolutely.
So depending on how to do that, some of our larger customers even do load testing in production outside of business hours. So they'll do web load testing and hit 500% of users on their production system to see how it coped. And especially around times like Click Frenzy, they even look at supplementing their production by adding some of UAT into their production environment for extra capacity. So there's some of the challenges they have. From a tooling perspective and a process perspective, how do we generally measure performance? So depending on what technology you're using, depending on what platform, there's a whole host of different options, right? Do you guys know what some of those are?
So when you say hosting, you mean hosting within the data center, hosting externally in the
So platform, so both. If I talk about, I don't want to mix concepts, but if I talk about normal internal infrastructure and cloud, the monitoring, the way you would monitor that could be slightly different. Well, it will be slightly different, right? So there are tools that even integrate in the cloud and run the cloud as well. I don't know if you guys know about that.
Yep.
So from a system test perspective, what kind of tooling would you generally use there?
to measure response times.
So not only response times, so I guess we then have to categorize what tooling I'm talking about.
Absolutely.
Right. So if I'm talking about .NET, Java based tooling, there's a bunch of different tooling that can look even down to a method level. right? And the way that can be tagged, you can look at when you do an integration test of identifying not only, so different CI dashboards, when you run a unit test, will tell you whether the functionality is okay or not, right? Typically. You can also have a dashboard that says, is performance okay? Were there lots of exceptions? So you can start generating things like that and working out whether things are okay. So it might pass the functionality test, but it generated a whole bunch of exception errors. So you can start to look at that. From not only our tool set does that, but there's some other tool sets that do that as well. When you go into SVT, obviously there's a whole bunch of different counters and stuff, things like load runner and still performer can bring in from an infrastructure perspective. But the problem you get in both SVT and IVVT is really the number of cycles you have to go through. So if you have a performance problem there, how many test runs do you have to reproduce to find? So there's infrastructure metrics, there's application metrics, there's network metrics depending on what kind of load you're doing or what kind of application it is. How do you really start to look at that? How am I going for time?
Yeah, okay, I'll let you know.
Okay. So from an SVT perspective, what kind of tools do you generally guys use to use load? Is it load runner, is it still performer, typically?
It depends on the client. I think, experience tells me if most clients don't have money, it's JMeter. And then if you push them and you nudge them a bit, probably it will be NeoLoad or it will probably be RPT. And if it's a client like Telstra, you probably have load runner licenses. But it depends.
Sure.
It really depends.
And people's budgets and whatever else.
Absolutely.
That's pretty right. Pretty accurate.
But my question is, right, so, sorry, I didn't get, what's IVVT? What is
So
IVVT?
verification and, I forgot the I stands for.
So, it's something like reproduction.
Yeah, it's basically the step between SVT and UAT.
Okay.
So, yeah.
So with the dashboards, and I guess this is just my experience which is weighing me down, that sometimes I think that's a little bit stupid, right? I've never really found performance to be truly automated unless you have a very simple app. Like with a functional unit test, you can build a dashboard for a functional unit test, and every time you have a release that goes through, run a bunch of tests, it spits out a dashboard. With performance, there are so many moving parts, right? So it's not that you just run a test and then automatically you get a report which gives you some numbers and everything is okay. Now, it takes months, if not years, to achieve that stability on a program where you get to a stage where your tests are running really smoothly and I can automate it. So I'm unable to understand the concept of automating performance testing from a DevOps perspective. So
automation, I'm going to talk product for a minute, right, at least. So one of the things we can do if using, still perform a load runner is we can inject those particular test cases when you do a load test. So you generally will have 5 or 10 or 15 different test cases or URLs or whatever you're hitting at the same time. So those things we can inject in that header as different tests. Every time you do a new release, you can test that test against itself, and you can baseline that performance. So straight away you know whether it's quicker or slower. Straight away you know whether there's more or less, whether there's more exceptions. So from a dashboarding perspective, from automation perspective, it's very, very quick.
So let me ask you that then, now I understand where you're coming from.
Yep.
How many of your clients, you don't have to, no client, I don't want you to do any
Sure.
client name. How many of your clients are truly mature, have you found in your experience, truly mature enough to give you the ability to automate performance testing across the life cycle? What percentage of clients do you find truly mature enough to automate, at least from an Australian standpoint?
So from an Australian standpoint, I would say 10 to 20%.
Can I give you a different perspective on that?
Yeah.
The problem is the technology is running away from us.
Why do you say that?
Well, I would, this is what customers say when I'm talking to them, right? And it's basically, it's very difficult, even with Agile and everything else, it's very difficult to keep up with latest, greatest versions and technology that's being released and everything else. And you try and adopt some of that, an incremental piece of that in another project that you release or another version that you release. But the speed at which organizations can create function and use products around software versus the runaway trend of new capabilities in software that they can purchase off the shelf, like performance tools, there's a gap there's a paper came out in the US and it's called the functionality gap. And what that means is, to put it in simple terms, take something like Microsoft Excel. How much of the actual function that Microsoft Excel provides you and all the pull-down menus do we actually use? And the chances are, if you go back to the 80s when we were using those 1, 2, 3 on DOS, you know, we were probably using 80% of the same function we're using today. It's only an incremental thing here and there that we're using. So there's this functionality gap that's created, that's coming out of all these new versions that people are finding it very difficult to use. So in terms of maturity, you know, I would suggest that a lot of people are genuinely trying to climb the maturity curve. The problem is the curve is shifting all the time. And so to keep up, I mean, let's face it, we're on the vendor end of the spectrum. And we're always going to create this next level that you've got to get to. You know what I'm saying? And the industry is doing that. And so I would suggest to you that with Agile, with some of the tooling that's available today, you know, for development and things like that, there's a real sophistication in the Australian marketplace around the way that we develop applications. If you layer performance across the top of that, I think there's a realization trend that's happening now that we've got to start to build performance in much earlier in the life cycle. But I think your point about how do you automate that? You can have a tool to do it in dev, potentially a tool to do it in test, potentially 3 or 4. Then you get into production, you've got a whole other tool that you're going to do performance testing with. Then you've got all the Google Analytics, all that kind of stuff that's hitting you from the front end. How do you manage all of that? That's the piece that that's why I'm thinking user experience is kind of underlying all of this, because from my perspective, it really comes down to, does the user really care, you know, whether a mainframe's gone down, if they're still getting the functionality that they want at a reasonable performance. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
So we talk about the difference between performance and availability.
I completely agree.
So to come back to your question, probably 10 to 20%. Why? Because most of them have matured, some of them have very mature production monitoring. Some of them have very, I'll say not very, reasonably mature dev integration where they do performance. They don't have the whole lot. And you know, there's cost associated with that, organisation associated with that. And a lot of them, you know, their testing team might come in and out and be transient. So how do they even follow processes from one release to the next release?
Okay, very much.
Well, often that piece is outsourced to someone.
Yeah, as well. So they're the challenges. So I don't want to, I'm kind of drawing Nirvana, but the point is that as you go through the life cycle, you need to make sure there's key points where you do performance monitoring. Most of our customers generally have them at least at SVT and production. Some of our customers actually do it from a dev perspective too. So they integrate in with their IDEs. So when they do a build and they do an initial unit test, they can also see performance. So the dev guys can fix things straight away. One of the benefits that, product again, is that when there's a, that's okay. When there's a problem in production,
3 more minutes.
cool. So when there's a problem in production, how do you actually pass that problem back to the dev guys? How do they reproduce it? How do they actually understand what the problem is? So some of the tools now can actually give you a session file which includes not only a capture of what happened, but why it happened. So which method was slow, which server it was on, what happened, was it, you know, was garbage collection actually having a massive problem, was it memory leaks? You can basically pass that back to the dev team that can build it in and see it and make sure that's fixed. From an SVT perspective, we talked about reducing the number of SVT cycles. So when we find performance problems, how do we get to that root cause? How do we fix that problem? So they're key challenges that our customers have. So probably a key customer everyone has, right? So how do we do that? I'm going to go to products off a second. Is by not only automating that but measuring that. We're okay. We'll clean up. So how do we do that? And it's really about instrumenting from a product perspective those particular environments, but having it so it's almost orchestrated, so when you do set up a test environment, SVT environment, it's very easy to set up and very easy to deploy.
I'd argue that the most important place to measure performance is in the dev sandbox environment, because typically system test is relatively advanced in the project. It's too late to change your base design. SVT, on a good day, 4 weeks before releasing other projects. So
Generally 2 weeks.
Way too late then. And what I've noticed in a lot of projects, in the early days, developers would bench up 6 different candidate designs, measure the stuffing of them in every way you could, choose the most performant, that's the one that then made it. By not doing that, you find that by the time it gets in system test for SVT, we've got a non-performing design, it's never going to perform. Let's get into some crisis remediation and try and get over the line. We've missed the boat.
Yep, completely agree. And but even if you fix that, once it gets into production, it still doesn't mean you won't have problems.
True, it's all downhill from there.
Correct. And time?
Yeah. Any questions on flows?
Really quick. So questions on this? I mean, I think it's really continue going on, but was there any questions about how we do this? I didn't even really talk about products, but one of the things we do to do this on Java and .NET applications is Dynatrace. And a few of our large customers in Australia already do that in all 3 environments and do it quite well.
So when you say Dynatrace, is it about the ability to use the product to basically do the monitoring across the stack? Or is it both monitoring and automated testing?
So it's all monitoring.
Okay,
So
monitoring.
you will have SVT tools, for example, like Silk Performer or Quick Test Pro or one of the other ones.
Okay.
It's just about injecting stuff into their headers, and then you can measure everything in the different tests. There's all dashboards out of the box for that.
Excellent. So basically I could use Dynatrace, instrument my environments, whether it's my dev,
Yep.
my test, SVD, pre-prior, and then basically see the performance of the code as it basically migrates across those environments. What about, which I come back, so that's good, and I think as part of these, we probably need some. We talk about the POC or something where we can get people engaged with something like Dynatrace and instrument the application and show them. What about the testing part of it? I think that's a big challenge, right? I don't want to drain this too much, but we spoke about automating. Now, when I think DevOps, unfortunately, I think Netflix, and and Netflix's ability to do break testing on the fly. But they are mature. They have a product that doesn't change that much, right? They've got scripts. They probably don't even use load runner, right? They got their scripts. They just fire it away, and all of that is automated in a nice, sexy dashboard, which you guys must have read off. But what about a project like the ones that we work on? We are on that for like 6 weeks, 8 weeks. Is there an opportunity to use something like a tool to do both the testing and the diagnostic side and automate all of that, or is it just a pipe dream?
I don't think there's too many vendors that do both and do integrate both, and definitely don't do it well. And I think what you'll find is every organisation has a different testing tool. So it's very variable. There's not one thing that will fit all of that. Generally, you could get a stack that will do all the monitoring, or you could get a stack that will do all of the testing.
Okay.
I don't think there's one that does everything.
Are you finding that vendors are working towards creating that integration and bridging that gap?
Getting close. The problems are vendors are so specialised in their piece that not necessarily through the whole thing. We do web load testing, and we do it through the entire environment, and we hook that into Dynatrace. So we can do cloud-based web load testing, and it does do full integration, and we call it Load 360. But that's more talking about a production web face kind of application.
Okay.
But that's talking more about still SVT, right? That's fully integrated SVT testing with diagnostics. So you can run a test, when there's a problem, click on it and find exactly the root cause in like 4 clicks. But that's at this level. When you talk about unit test and system test and all tiers, there's not one product that does that.
Okay, cool. Thank you.
Or many vendors. Thanks. Any other questions?
Any other
What
questions?
about is it still reactive type monitoring in terms of you find a problem in production and then you go and find the root cause rather than predicting that a problem's going to occur in the future? Because all the monitoring seems to be reactive rather than predictive, where they should be using historical data to predict trends.
That purely comes down to how mature the organisation is from an APM standpoint. So we have customers who are very mature, and I would say pick up a lot of their problems in test or dev, or even UAT. In reality, when it gets to SVT and they do some testing. And the one that I'm thinking of at the moment is one that actually has Dynatrace all the way through, so they can do regression testing and do that.
Nice.
And they actually hand off, when there is a problem in production, they hand the problem session file, because they capture the problem, and they pass it to the devs, and they actually fix it. And then they can regression test it and make sure it doesn't happen. So when you, even on the edge cases, they can see them in production. It's not, it's happened and it's gone. It's happened, they've captured it, and they can actually export that file and send it to the dev guys. And a couple of our bigger customers even do that with their third-party developers. So they don't need to be licensed for Dynatrace, they can access the viewer. They just send them the session file. They can open it and see exactly what the method path was that caused it. Was it a third party? Was it a database call? Exactly what database call was it? What were the bind variables? All of that. So that's from a complete NPM lifecycle perspective. I've probably gone over time now. Right.
Any, should wrap up? Anything else?
Yep, no, that's fine.
Okay, cool. Cool. Thanks for that, Troy.
So don't go away.